January 1945. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima still clung to the air like a veil of death. In the holding area near the beachhead, a young Japanese soldier named Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto sat with his hands bound behind his back. His uniform shredded and stained with blood that might have been his own or his comrades', he could no longer tell. His feet, wrapped in rotting cloth that had once been socks, throbbed with infection. He had not bathed in 47 days. The smell of his own body disgusted him. But there was no water to spare in the caves, no time to think of cleanliness when every breath might be your last. Around him, other prisoners sat in similar silence, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death. They had been told the Americans would torture them, mutilate them, parade them through streets as animals. Yamamoto closed his eyes and waited for the brutality to begin. What arrived instead was a truck with a red cross painted on its side. American medics, young men barely older than Yamamoto himself, approached with canteens of clean water. One of them, a freckled boy from Nebraska, knelt beside him and offered the canteen. Yamamoto stared at it, certain it was poisoned or some cruel prelude to violence. But his thirst overpowered his fear. He drank. The water was cold, pure, and tasted like nothing he had known in months. The medic smiled, not with malice but with something Yamamoto could not name. Kindness, perhaps, or pity. He could not decide which was more unsettling. Within hours, Yamamoto and the other prisoners were transported to a temporary holding facility on Guam. What he saw there defied everything he had been conditioned to believe. The camp was orderly, almost sterile in its organization. Rows of tents stood in neat lines. There were latrines, real latrines, not hastily dug holes. There were medical tents staffed with doctors who treated wounds without question, without judgment. And then, as the sun dipped below the Pacific horizon, a sergeant gestured toward a row of wooden structures. "Showers," he said in broken Japanese. "Hot water." Yamamoto did not understand at first. Hot water? Here in a prison camp? On an island still scarred by war? It seemed impossible, a trick of translation or a hallucination born of exhaustion. But the other prisoners were already moving toward the structures, their faces registering the same disbelief. Yamamoto followed. Inside pipes lined the walls. The sergeant turned a valve, and water, steam rising from it, poured from the shower heads. The sound of it, the sight of it, struck Yamamoto like a physical blow. He stepped beneath the stream, still wearing his torn uniform, and felt the heat soak into his skin. Around him men began to weep, not from pain, but from the sudden, incomprehensible mercy of it. This moment, small and seemingly mundane, would ripple through the psyche of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war during the final year of the Pacific conflict. It was not the grand battles or the atomic fires that first cracked the ideological armor of Imperial Japan's soldiers. It was the simple, undeniable reality of a hot shower. It was the realization that the enemy they had been taught to hate as barbaric demons possessed a material wealth and a concept of human dignity so vast, so casually abundant, that even their prisoners lived better than Japanese soldiers in active service. To understand the profound shock of this experience, one must first understand the world these men came from. The average Japanese soldier in 1945 had endured years of deprivation that bordered on medieval. The Imperial Japanese Army, despite its early victories and its reputation for fanaticism, was a logistical catastrophe by the war's end. Supply lines had collapsed. Ships carrying food and medicine to distant garrisons were torpedoed by American submarines at a staggering rate. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines, Japanese soldiers ate tree bark, roots, and when desperation reached its zenith, the flesh of their own dead. Disease killed more men than bullets. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, all the ancient killers of armies without adequate supply. In the caves of Iwo Jima, soldiers rationed water by the spoonful. A single grain of rice became a treasure. Men fought over scraps of rotten fish. There were no replacements for uniforms, no soap, no bandages that were not already soaked in someone else's blood. The concept of a hot bath was not merely absent, It was a memory from another lifetime, a ghost of the world before war. Many soldiers had not seen their families in years. Many had not received mail in months. The psychological toll of this isolation, this relentless erosion of humanity, cannot be overstated. They were men reduced to the biology of survival, fighting not for ideology but simply to see another dawn. And yet they had been told, repeatedly, relentlessly, that they were the superior race, that Japan's divine mission was to liberate Asia from Western decadence, that the Americans were soft, corrupt, obsessed with material comfort at the expense of spiritual strength. The propaganda machine of Imperial Japan painted the United States as a mongrel nation, a land of cowards who would crumble when faced with the purity of Yamato spirit. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was not merely disgraceful, but impossible, that death was the only honorable path if capture became imminent. The Senjin-kun, the military code issued in 1941, explicitly forbade surrender. "Do not live in shame as a prisoner," it commanded. "Die to avoid the ignominy of being captured." So when these men, broken and starving, fell into American hands and were met not with execution, but with medicine, food, and hot showers, the cognitive dissonance was total. Yamamoto, standing beneath that stream of hot water on Guam, felt the collapse of his entire understanding of the world. He had been prepared to die. He had been prepared to suffer. But he had not been prepared for this, for an enemy that treated him better than his own officers had. The American military's treatment of Japanese prisoners was not born purely of altruism, though there were certainly individual acts of compassion. It was also strategic. The United States had signed the Geneva Conventions, and while Japan had not, had in fact refused to extend such protections to Allied prisoners, the American command understood the value of humane treatment. A well-treated prisoner was a source of intelligence. A well-treated prisoner might broadcast messages urging his comrades to surrender, potentially saving American lives. And beyond the tactical, there was a deeper ideological calculation. The treatment of prisoners was a demonstration of American values, a living contrast to the brutality of totalitarian regimes. The camps themselves were designed with this in mind. At facilities like the one on Guam, or the larger installations in Hawaii and the American mainland, Japanese prisoners found conditions that shocked them into silence. They were given 3 meals a day, meals that, by 1945, often exceeded in quality and quantity what American civilians on rationed diets received. The Red Cross inspected the camps. Prisoners were allowed to write letters, to receive packages, to work for small wages. Medical care was not perfunctory but thorough. Dentists filled cavities. Surgeons operated on old wounds that had festered for months. And yes, there were showers, hot showers available daily with soap provided. Corporal Yamamoto, in the weeks following his capture, gained 12 pounds. His infected feet healed. He received new clothes. Not a uniform, but clean cotton trousers and a shirt. He was given a toothbrush, an item he had not seen since departing Japan in 1943. At night, he lay on a cot with a thin mattress and a blanket, and he could not sleep for the strangeness of it. He had spent so many months on stone, on dirt, on the bare earth of trenches, that the softness felt wrong, almost sinful. But his body, traitorous and grateful, relaxed into it. He was not alone in his bewilderment. In the mess hall, prisoners from different units, different islands, different circles of hell, exchanged stories in hushed tones. A private from Saipan spoke of the first time he tasted American bread. White, soft, nothing like the rock-hard biscuits issued by the Imperial Army. A sergeant from Peleliu described the moment a camp guard had given him a cigarette, not as a bribe or a taunt, but simply as a gesture between men. Another man, tears in his eyes, recounted how a Navy doctor had spent an hour removing shrapnel from his back, working with a care that seemed incomprehensible. "Why?" they asked each other. "Why do they treat us this way?" The answer, when it came, arrived not through words but through observation. The abundance was not an act. It was not a performance for propaganda. It was simply the baseline reality of American logistics. The United States, untouched by bombing, its industrial base roaring at full capacity, produced war materiel at a scale that defied comprehension. By 1945, American factories were turning out a new ship every day, an aircraft every 5 minutes. The supply chain that kept these prison camps stocked with food, medicine, and soap was the same chain that fed an army of millions across 2 oceans. The hot water was not a luxury. It was a byproduct of a system so efficient, so over-engineered, that even its prisoners lived in conditions that surpassed the average Japanese soldier's best day. This realization crept into the minds of prisoners slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape they did not recognize. Yamamoto, scrubbing his body in the shower one evening, found himself thinking of his unit's commanding officer, Lieutenant Saito, who had hoarded the last tin of sardines while his men starved. He thought of the propaganda broadcasts that had promised Japan's inevitable victory, even as their ammunition ran out and their reinforcements never came. He thought of the slogan drilled into every recruit, 100 million die together, and he wondered for the first time if he had been lied to. The American soldiers who guarded the camp were young, like him. They chewed gum incessantly, a habit that fascinated the prisoners. They listened to music on portable radios, jazz and swing that seemed to pulse with an energy entirely foreign to the rigid military marches of Japan. They wrote letters home and received packages filled with candy, magazines, photographs. They complained about the heat, the boredom, the distance from home, but they did so with a casualness that suggested they expected to survive, to return, to resume lives interrupted but not destroyed. They did not speak of death as a sacred duty. They spoke of it as a tragedy to be avoided. One guard, a corporal from Texas named Miller, struck up a peculiar friendship with Yamamoto. Miller's Japanese was atrocious, Yamamoto's English barely better, but they communicated through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and a shared love of baseball. Miller taught Yamamoto the rules of the American game, so similar to the besuboru played in Japan but subtly different. They argued in broken phrases about which league was superior. Miller showed Yamamoto a photograph of his girl back home, a blonde woman with a wide smile. Yamamoto hesitantly spoke of his mother, of the letters he had not sent, the letters he could not send because he was supposed to be dead. Miller, chewing his gum, considered this. Then he said, in his mangled Japanese, "War is stupid." Yamamoto, who had been taught that war was glorious, who had been told that death in battle was the highest honor, found he could not disagree. The psychological transformation of Japanese prisoners was documented extensively by American intelligence officers. Interrogators noted that the initial shock of capture gave way, within days or weeks, to a kind of relieved pragmatism. Once the taboo of surrender was broken, many prisoners became cooperative, even eager to assist. They provided intelligence on troop movements, fortifications, morale. Some volunteered to broadcast messages to their former comrades, urging surrender. These men, dubbed birds that have flown from the cage by their captors, were evidence of the brittleness of Japanese military indoctrination when confronted with contradictory reality. But it was the small material comforts, the hot showers, the clean clothes, the full meals, that did the deepest work. Ideology is a fragile thing when your body has been broken by deprivation. The grand narratives of empire and destiny fade when you are simply trying to keep your feet from rotting off. Yamamoto, standing in line for dinner one evening, accepted a tray piled with rice, canned meat, and vegetables. He sat at a long table surrounded by other prisoners and ate slowly, savoring each bite. Across from him, a young sailor from the Yamato stared at his plate and whispered, "We lost. We lost and we didn't even know it." The hot shower became, in the collective memory of these men, a symbol. It was not the bullets or the bombs that convinced them of defeat. It was the casual, crushing abundance of an enemy that could afford to give its prisoners hot water. It was the realization that America's power was not just in its weapons, but in its capacity to produce, to supply, to sustain. Japan had bet everything on spirit, on the willingness to die. America had bet on factories, farms, and the assumption that life was worth living. As the war ground toward its conclusion, the number of Japanese prisoners grew. After the fall of Okinawa, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, the trickle became a flood. Soldiers emerged from jungles, caves, and bunkers, expecting death, and finding instead a bureaucratic process of registration, medical screening, and assignment to camps. Many wept when they first bathed. Many refused to believe the war was over until they saw it in writing, in their own language, signed by the Emperor himself. In the camps, a new culture emerged. Prisoners organized themselves, held classes, taught skills. Some learned English. Others studied agriculture, mechanics, trades they hoped might serve them in a defeated Japan. They received news, filtered through camp newspapers and radio broadcasts, of the destruction back home. Cities flattened, the economy shattered, millions homeless. The world they had left behind no longer existed. And yet here in these camps, surrounded by barbed wire and guards, they found a strange stability, a rhythm of days that was predictable, and by the standards of the past years, almost comfortable. Yamamoto, in the spring of 1946, was among a group of prisoners slated for repatriation. The war had been over for months. Japan was occupied, its military disbanded, its empire dissolved. He packed the few belongings he had accumulated: a notebook, a bar of soap, a photograph Miller had given him. On his last night he took a final hot shower. The water cascaded over him, and he thought of the man he had been when he first arrived, the skeletal, terrified soldier who believed he was about to be killed. He thought of Miller, who had been shipped home to Texas months ago. He thought of the war, which had taken years of his life and left him with scars both visible and hidden. The ship that carried him back to Japan was an American vessel, a transport converted from a cargo hauler. The prisoners were given bunks, blankets, and regular meals. The journey took weeks. Yamamoto stood on the deck one evening watching the sun set over the Pacific, and a fellow prisoner, a man named Tanaka, who had survived Guadalcanal, joined him. They stood in silence for a long time before Tanaka spoke. "Do you think we'll tell them?" he asked. "Tell them what?" Yamamoto replied. "The truth," Tanaka said. "About the showers, about the food, about how they treated us." Yamamoto considered this. "They won't believe us," he said finally. "They'll think we've been brainwashed." Tanaka nodded slowly. "Maybe, but we know. We know what we saw." When Yamamoto finally set foot on Japanese soil, the landscape was unrecognizable. Yokohama, where he had departed for war, was a field of rubble. Families lived in makeshift shelters. Children begged for food. The smell of ash and decay hung over everything. He made his way to his hometown, a small village in Shikoku that had been spared the worst of the bombing, and found his mother still alive, older and frailer, but alive. She wept when she saw him, touching his face as if he were a ghost made solid. He told her he had been a prisoner, expecting shame or horror. Instead, she simply held him and said, "You're home. That's all that matters." In the years that followed, Yamamoto rarely spoke of his time as a prisoner. The shame of surrender, though officially absolved by the Emperor's command, lingered in the culture. Men who had been captured were often ostracized, denied jobs, whispered about. But in private moments, among other veterans, the stories emerged. The stories of the hot showers, the stories of the kindness that had been harder to endure than cruelty because it shattered everything they had been taught. These stories were passed down, quietly, a counter-narrative to the official histories of valor and sacrifice. Historians, decades later, would pore over the records of these camps, the testimonies of prisoners, the reports of intelligence officers. They would note the effectiveness of humane treatment as a tool of psychological warfare. They would analyze the logistics that made such treatment possible. But the deeper truth, the one that men like Yamamoto carried with them to their graves, was simpler and more devastating. They had been broken not by violence, but by mercy. Not by deprivation, but by abundance. They had seen the face of the enemy and found it unexpectedly human, unexpectedly generous, and that generosity had been the final, unanswerable argument against everything they had been told. The hot shower, that mundane miracle of plumbing and hot water heaters, became in memory a kind of baptism. It was the moment when the filth of war was washed away, but also the moment when illusions dissolved. It was the point of no return, the instant when the lies of empire could no longer hold against the weight of lived experience. For men who had been told that death was preferable to dishonor, who had been promised that their suffering had meaning, the kindness of captivity was a crueler revelation than any torture could have been. It proved that they had been expendable, that their leaders had spent their lives like currency and gotten nothing in return, while the enemy they were supposed to despise had resources so vast they could afford to waste them on compassion. In the broader tapestry of the Pacific War, these moments, the showers, the meals, the small gestures of humanity, are footnotes. They do not appear in the grand narratives of Midway, Iwo Jima, or the atomic bombs. But for the men who lived them, they were earthquakes. They were the moments when the war was truly lost, not on the battlefield but in the quiet realization that everything they had believed was a lie. And in that loss, paradoxically, some found a kind of liberation. The burden of the divine mission, the weight of racial superiority, the crushing obligation to die rather than admit defeat, all of it fell away in the steam of a hot shower, and what remained was simply a man, grateful to be alive, grateful to be clean, grateful to be treated as if his life had value. Corporal Miller, back in Texas, married his blonde girlfriend and took over his father's hardware store. He rarely spoke of the war, but he kept Yamamoto's name and village written in a small notebook, and he wondered sometimes if the Japanese soldier had made it home if he was alive, if he remembered their arguments about baseball. He never tried to find out. Some connections, forged in the strange intimacy of war, are meant to remain unfinished, suspended in time like a photograph that captures a moment but not its aftermath. Yamamoto lived until 1987. He worked as a school teacher, married, raised 2 children, and watched Japan rise from the ashes into an economic power that rivaled and then surpassed many of its former enemies. He never returned to the military, never spoke publicly about his service, but he kept a bar of American soap, wrapped in cloth, in a drawer in his home. His wife found it after his death, and not understanding its significance, nearly threw it away. His son, who had heard fragments of stories over the years, stopped her. He kept the soap, and when his own daughter asked about it, he told her the story his father had told him, of a war that was lost not on the beaches or in the skies, but in a moment of unexpected kindness, in the simple, devastating luxury of hot water. The Pacific War was a conflict of distances and deprivations, of supply lines stretched to the breaking point and soldiers abandoned to their fates. It was a war in which the material and the moral intertwined, where the capacity to produce and provide became inseparable from the legitimacy of the cause. The Japanese soldier, told he fought for a divine emperor and a sacred mission, discovered in captivity that his enemy fought for a different creed, one that valued life, even enemy life, enough to offer it comfort in defeat. This was not a moral superiority born of philosophy or religion, but a practical one rooted in the brute fact of abundance. America could afford to be kind. Japan by 1945 could not even afford to feed its own. The hot shower was a symbol, yes, but it was also a truth. It was the truth that ideology, no matter how fervently believed, cannot survive prolonged contact with a better material reality. It was the truth that men will endure almost anything for a cause they believe in, but they will also question that cause when they see their enemies living better than they ever did. It was the truth that wars are won not just by courage or tactics, but by the sheer overwhelming capacity to sustain, to supply, to endure, not through spirit alone, but through the less glamorous work of factories and farms and freight trains. In the end, the story of Japanese prisoners and their astonishment at American camps is not a story of humiliation, though there was humiliation in it. It is not a story of conversion, though some men did abandon the ideology that had sustained them. It is a story about the collision of worldviews, the moment when the abstract becomes concrete, when propaganda meets reality and shatters. It is a story about the strange, uncomfortable power of kindness in the midst of total war, and the way that power could undo a man more thoroughly than any weapon. The steam rose from the showers in those camps, dissipating into the tropical air, and with it rose the certainty of young men who had been taught they were gods chosen for a divine mission. What replaced it was more uncertain, more human, and infinitely more true. The knowledge that they were men, that they had been used, and that somewhere across the ocean was a nation that could afford to give even its enemies hot water. That knowledge, bitter and liberating in equal measure, was the real surrender. Not the formal ceremony on the deck of the Missouri, but the quiet interior collapse that happened in the warmth of a shower, in the taste of real food, in the simple, unassailable fact that they had been wrong about almost everything. And so they begged to stay longer, not because they loved their captors, but because the camps offered something Japan no longer could. The promise that tomorrow would come, that there would be enough to eat, that the basic dignities of human existence would be honored. In that promise, more than in any battle or bomb, lay the true measure of victory and defeat. The war ended not when the guns fell silent, but when the last illusion fell away, washed clean in the unexpected mercy of hot water, leaving behind only men who had survived and who would spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of what they had survived.